Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with sphistory.com, and today we are beginning a new series. Pretty famous photograph. Pretty much everyone, even JFK novices, have seen the three tramps, the photograph of the three tramps. And there's been a lot of speculation over the years about who are the three tramps, um, most of it erroneous. And so we're going to be looking at for the next four episodes is the story of Chauncey Holt and his telling of the Three Tramp story. And quite a bit of corroboration for this. This reminds me a lot of the Roscoe White story, which, one of the things it becomes a problem, I think, for people who delve into conspiracies is that they become very resistant to the simple explanation over time. It always has to be complicated. It always has to be uh, more than what meets the eye. In fact, it can't be just readily observable or easily believable from someone who's telling the story. There's always got to be this healthy dose of skepticism. And sometimes you can get trapped in your own skepticism and miss the obvious, like the nose that's on your face. And that's one of the tricky things that you have to learn to maneuver when you're examining these conspiracies. 'Cause some of it is when you get dealing with the CIA, you're dealing with a lot of sleight of hand and diversion and deception, and you find that you have to weed through the first story, the second story, the third story to get to the truth, and you become conditioned that everything is like that. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is obvious, and I think the trick is trying to differentiate between the two. So I've labeled this series of episodes The Three Tramps and the Story of Chauncey Holt. And if you haven't seen the photograph, there's many different versions of it because these guys were led through Dealey Plaza in broad daylight 2 hours after the assassination. And from the railroad yard boxcar through Dealey Plaza along Elm onto Houston to the command center that had been hastily set up in the criminal courts building. And there were newspaper people just crawling all over the place and they're taking photos. They weren't handcuffs, as you can see, but they're being led along by police. And and then they just sort of melted into the ether and just disappeared without having been identified. There was no arrest report. None of them were arrested. And so there's just been a lot of suspicion about who they were, what their role was, why they were hiding in a boxcar at the time of an assassination, why they were released, why there wasn't any arrest or record of their who they were. And just like in the assassination itself, where there were no eyewitnesses, it leaves open to speculation a lot of different angles. And so that's what we want to look at. Story of Chauncey Holt and these three tramps. The three tramps part of this story will come at the end. We'll get to it. But first, we need to talk about the story of Chauncey Holt and establish who he was so that you will understand why his story about the three tramps rings true, makes sense. This is a picture of out in Baltimore area. It's the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard Company in Baltimore, Maryland, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But Chauncey was born in 1921 in Kentucky, and he was raised in a way of life that was pretty normal in Kentucky to people who are of Scots-Irish ancestry. Bootlegging was just a way of life. It was how you made a living. And so right away from his earliest recollection, he was living on the other side of the law. And though it was accepted in his walk or in his, with his friends and with his family, et cetera, et cetera. And where he came from, seemingly everyone was involved in it. So it wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but it does establish him uh, as sort of an outlaw from his earliest days. When he was 19, he joined the Air Force, or the Army Air Force, which is called the USAAF. The U.S. Air Force, as we know it today, hadn't yet been created. So this is the United States Army Air Force. And he got in trouble right away when he was in the Army. He got court-martialed after about a year in the service, and he got sent to the United States Penitentiary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He had attacked another soldier with a rifle, and so they put him away. And in 1940, June 1940, he was released, but then he deserted. Excuse me, from the Army. And after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he eventually returned to duty. That's kind of interesting. Nowhere in my research of Chauncey Holt did I find that there was any recrimination by the Army for him having deserted. I guess they were so desperate for soldiers after Pearl Harbor, they just took him back, didn't ask any questions. 2 years later, couldn't stay out of trouble. 2 years later, he took an unauthorized joyride in a car from Fort Knox to Louisville. He was arrested, charged with auto theft. And back then, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover especially were really after car thieves. And so this was a major crime as far as the FBI was concerned. So he was sentenced to 8 months or 18 months in the Industrial Reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio. So, he's in his early 20s and he's already been in Fort Leavenworth, and now he's in a reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio. This is where his life took a turn. Up till now, you could say his criminal background was petty, you know, petty larceny, bootlegging, joyriding in a car that wasn't his, uh, fighting, and sent to Fort Leavenworth, being court-martialed, et cetera, et cetera. But when he was incarcerated the second time in Chillicothe, Ohio, he met his first organized crime figure. And it was Cy and Morris Bloom. These are brothers from the Baltimore area. And they had handled bookmaking operations for Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was from the Baltimore area, had a son who was being cared for. We'll talk about him in a minute, in the Baltimore area. And he was, if you know anything about Meyer Lansky, he was into money. All organized crime figures were, but he was a Jewish organized crime figure, which means he could never be a made man. But he was kind of known as the banker, the unofficial banker of all the mob organizations in the 50s and early 60s. He was really, really good with money, really, really good with money. And he sort of professionalized organized crime. He was just a stickler for organization and math, figures, money, et cetera, et cetera. And he had a bookmaking operation in Baltimore, and these brothers, Cy and Morris Bloom, the reason they were in the reformatory in Chillicothe with Chauncey Holt, because they got caught probably, engaged in some kind of loan sharking or whatever. But they were in the same reformatory with Chauncey Holt. So they met and they became friends. And after his release, Holt left Kentucky and Ohio, and he went out with the Bloom brothers, using his connections with them. They set him up to work at this shipyard company in Baltimore, Maryland, because they intended on, they'd sort of recruited him. And so until such time he could be fully employed in their organization, they got him a job out here at the shipyard company in Baltimore, Maryland. So this is sort of the background of this guy, Chauncey. The thing to remember is he was always an outlaw. But it wasn't until he went to prison the second time that he became a professional outlaw. Uh, so much for rehabilitation, right? Interestingly, he was not your typical outlaw in the sense that he was just a thug or somebody who could use his fists or whatever. He was sort of a Renaissance man, which is how he's going to get noticed. He had developed painting skills. Now, some of this developed while he was in prison. He had nothing else to do, and he had a special talent for painting. And this would lead to a 50-year relationship between himself and a mafioso in Detroit named Peter Licavoli. And Licavoli had an appetite for fine art, and so he used part of this relationship is going to be him exploiting Chauncey Holt's painting skills in his effort to accumulate art, but a lot of it had to do with making money through his organized crime outfit. Because if you can paint, you can probably counterfeit. If you can paint, you can probably forge documents. And really, there's no limit to what your talents can be utilized for uh, in a less than honorable way, right? So the painting skills got him noticed by Peter Licavoli, but his math skills got him noticed by Meyer Lansky. Now remember, he's up in Baltimore now, and he's got a relationship with these Bloom brothers who work for Meyer Lansky. And eventually, over time, that working relationship got him noticed by Meyer Lansky, who came back and forth from Miami and Florida up to Baltimore to manage his operations up there, but also to visit his son. And during the times that he would come into Baltimore and meet the Bloom brothers, he would he found out about this Chauncey Holt and his extraordinary math skills. He was he was good with accounting and money managing. These were all the things Meyer Lansky valued. That's what he was good at. On top of that, because he'd been in the military, he had been trained in weapons training, and he'd also been trained as a pilot. So if you are a organized crime figure and you're always recruiting people that can help your operation. Here is a guy who has a lot of different skills wrapped into one package, all of which can prove beneficial to your operation. The painting skills can be used in your forgery and document forgery and counterfeiting operations. The math skills can be useful in the accounting and money managing, weapons training, obviously, and pilot training, obviously. So all of a sudden, Chauncey Holt is a man in demand. I mentioned that Meyer Lansky would go back and forth visiting in Baltimore, and he there were two reasons. First of all, he visited the Bloom brothers, and because they were in charge of his bookmaking operation up there, so obviously he's touching base with them. But another reason was personal. His son Buddy suffered from cerebral palsy. If you look at this picture as I'm looking at it, he's the son on the right, and he's got cerebral palsy, and he was in the Fields Clinic in Boston. So he would come up to Baltimore, hang out with the Bloom brothers a little bit, then he'd swing by Boston and visit his son. And whether or not this is how Lansky met Chauncey Holt, I don't know. I was never able to determine that in my research. I just know that they met, whether it was through the Bloom brothers or through his son Buddy. It turns out Holt knew Buddy because he had been working on a painting project across the street from the Fields Clinic, and they would bring the patients out to the front yard to get some sun. And little Buddy liked to play chess, and Chauncey Holt liked to play chess, and so you'd oftentimes take a break from his work and sit with Buddy and play chess with him. So it's just inevitable that he's going to meet Meyer, whether it's through his son Buddy or through his business associates, the Bloom brothers. And sure enough, on one of these visits, to Baltimore, Cy Bloom called Chauncey and asked him if he wanted to meet the famous mobster. And so Bloom had told Lansky about Chauncey prior. And so evidently Lansky had asked about him. And so they were arranging this meeting. And what the Bloom brothers had told Meyer was that this guy Chauncey's a math genius. And of course, that means Meyer wants to meet him because Meyer was sort of fancied himself as a math genius. And he thought, well, I'll test him. And he gave him a math problem. And it was a trick. It was sort of a trick question. And long story short, Chauncey caught on to the trick. And he told Lansky that the problem couldn't be solved because it was a trick question. Of course, that was the right answer. And so Lansky, that led to some more conversations between the two. It was pretty apparent to Meyer Lansky that Chauncey Holt had a special skill, that the Bloom brothers were right. He was a math genius. He was already working for him by extension, by helping him out with the Bloom brothers. So he invited him to Miami. And it turns out Chauncey knew more about math than even Meyer did, and specifically with respect to analytical differential calculus. This was a subject that Lansky was interested in, but didn't know anything about, and didn't have anybody who could teach him. But now he found somebody who knew something about it. So he invites him, says, come down and tutor me in this analytical differential calculus. And this is the beginning of a relationship between Holt and Lansky, which lasted from 1944 to Lansky's eventual trip to Israel in 1972. So you're talking about almost 30 years. So what we've established so far is that Chauncey Holt has a relationship with the Bloom brothers, which started in prison. And he also has a relationship with the Detroit mafioso, mob boss named Peter Licavoli as a result of his painting skills, which lasts almost 50 years. And then he has a relationship with Meyer Lansky, which lasts almost 30 years because of his math skills. This guy is tied in with organized crime. And of course, in addition to those skills, he can fire a weapon. He knows just about everything that there is to know about weapons, and he can pilot a plane. This guy is a Renaissance man when it comes to all the different things he dabbles in and has expertise in. Just as a little bit of evidence, this is going to be consistent throughout these presentations. You're going to see communication. You're going to see letters that are written, memos, different forms of communication back and forth between all these people, which proves a lot of the story that Chauncey is telling later on in life. This particular letter was dated May 25th, 1970. So this is right before Meyer Lansky decides to goes to Israel. He's already made the decision. And he's writing Chauncey, hoping to meet up with him one last time before he leaves. He says, Dear Chauncey, I have decided to go and live in Israel. I would like to see you before I go. Fly down here. He was down in Miami. If you can. I don't care. I don't dare come to LA, which is where Chauncey is living. If I don't get to see you before we leave, I want to thank you for the past favors. Keep your nose clean. I will write you from Israel if I don't get to see you. Your friend, Meyer. So this is just some corroboration of the almost 30-year relationship between Lansky and Chauncey, as evidenced by this letter. So what are some of these past favors that Meyer Lansky is referring to? Well, one of them has to do with Bugsy Siegel. You know the story. Maybe you've seen the movie. Bugsy Siegel had become sort of the point man for the mob out in Las Vegas. And Lansky, there are rumors about Bugsy and his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, which later they were married at some point. And rumors were that Bugsy was siphoning off money or skimming money that the mob was sending out to Las Vegas to build Las Vegas. He was siphoning off some of it, squirreling it away in a private account for he and Virginia. that they were going to retire on it sometime, because it just didn't seem like the books added up, the amount of money that the mob was sending out there versus the progress that was being made in the construction of Las Vegas. So at some point, Lansky and Chauncey took a trip out to Las Vegas to crunch some numbers and verify if all the money's being spent like as it was supposed to be being spent on construction costs. And on the trip out to Las Vegas, Lansky told Holt, quote, he wasn't worried about J. Edgar Hoover because, quote, the mob had compromising photos of him and Clyde Tolson taken at the El Chorro Lodge in La Jolla, California. Of course, if you've watched any of my other videos in the JFK assassination about the mob, you know that's true. That's why J. Edgar Hoover always denied that there was even the existence of a mob or organized crime. But what he was worried about was, quote, Siegel's mishandling their money in Las Vegas. And they were going out, he and Holt were going out there to prove it or to verify, to see if the rumors were true. And so the first person they met with when they went out there was the general contractor who did all the work for him. And they asked to see the bills, the invoices. And a quick look at the invoices revealed that Siegel had not paid him near as much money as he claimed. In fact, it was clear to Holt and Lansky that Siegel was indeed stealing money from the mob. You know, he's saying all this money he paid to this general contractor. The general contractor produces the invoices, and they don't line up. So somewhere along the way, the money got lost. The only person who handled it in between the mob back home and the general contractor, the middle guy, was Bugsy Siegel. So at a subsequent meeting in Havana, Cuba, Meyer Lansky had to present this evidence to the other mafiosos, and they wanted to kill him. You don't steal from the mob. But they decide, and it's primarily because of Lansky's petitioning on his behalf. He said he went to bat for Siegel, and he said, maybe we should allow him to skim a little bit. He's doing us a favor out there doing it out in the middle of the desert. And they say, well, we'll give him one last chance. Go out there and confront Siegel. If he admits to it, maybe we can work with him and we can get past this. So they send Lansky and Holt back to Las Vegas, this time to confront Siegel with what they've learned. And this time, Siegel did not respond the way you'd think a condemned man would respond, because anybody in the mafia that's accused of stealing, has to know that if that's found out to be true, it's a death sentence. On June 19th, 1947, after being confronted by Lansky and Holt, Siegel told them both to shove it. And he claimed that the Flamingo was his and he was keeping it, which effectively signed his own death warrant. So basically doubled down. He said, you stick your little accusations where the sun don't shine, basically. And, by the way, on top of that, this hotel that mob money built, it's mine. And it's not yours. It's not theirs. It's not the mafia. It's not organized crime. It's mine. Me and Virginia's. It's ours. Well, I don't know if Siegel was just stupid or what, but I mean, you figure Lansky has to go back now and report to his boss, or all these other mafiosos what Siegel has said. Turns out they were right. Lansky was wrong. So ain't no point in going back and reporting to another, waiting for another meeting in Havana, Cuba to tell him what I think what happened was, in this case, they told him, if he handles it this way, we'll handle it that way. If he responds this way, we'll handle it that way. Of course, the response that Siegel had was, like I said, it effectively signed his own death warrant, which happened the next day, June 20, 1947, this famous picture of Siegel after he's shot by the mob, 3 shots to the head. And Holt's role in this is one of the favors that Lansky was referring to, is that he looked he provided lookout surveillance for the hit. They followed him around all day, and they caught him here where he was completely caught unawares, and they killed him. So this is the first favor that we know of that Chauncey admits to where somebody died as a result of his relationship with an organized crime figure. And though he didn't shoot him, he was involved in the hit. He and Lansky followed him around all day, and Holt's job was to provide lookout surveillance. And when he was in his most vulnerable position, they took him out. So that's one of the favors. All right, so let's talk about Peter Licavoli. A lot of people don't know about this guy, and I don't know a lot about him. You know, you don't think of when you think of the mob, you think of New York, you think of New Orleans, you think of Tampa and Miami. You don't think of Detroit. Not the top of the list. You think of Chicago, L.A., Las Vegas. You don't think of Detroit. But Peter Licavoli was one of the most important organized crime figures in the United. He was sort of a old school mafioso, and he had gotten his start when he was imported into Detroit as part of the quote Purple Gang, and he was an enforcer. So this guy was a he was kind of like what Jimmy Hoffa used to be for the Teamsters. He was a thug, and in the 40s he took over and became one of the 5 ruling dons of Detroit. Now, Detroit did their families a little different than New York City. New York City had 5 families headed by 5 different dons, and they all worked together in a commission. Detroit had 1 family headed by 5 dons who shared power. So 5 families versus 1, but they both had 5 dons. And Licavoli was, as we said, old school. So when you think of old school mafia activities, loan sharking, prostitution, all the normal mob vices, protection, scams, et cetera, et cetera. But where he and Chauncey Holt crossed paths was because Licavoli was also a sucker for Italian art. And according to Holt, Licavoli bought this Italian art by the roomful in his mansion. He had just room after room, all this Italian art, and fancied himself a painter as well. And so Holt actually said he was a competent painter. And so Licavoli was attracted to other people, in this case, Chauncey Holt, who had similar interests. And of course, Holt's painting skills made him useful, not just because of the art, but because, as I mentioned, the forging of documents and counterfeiting, etc. And here's a picture of Peter Licavoli in his younger years. So that's sort of the genesis of the relationship that Chauncey Holt had with some pretty prominent mafiosos in the United States in the 40s and the 50s. Peter Licavoli in Detroit, Meyer Lansky down in Miami. And so now we get into the 50s, 1953, the Kefauver hearings are taking place in Washington. And these are the hearings where the Congress is trying to get to, expose organized crime. And of course, remember now, J. Edgar Hoover had been claiming all this time there was no organized crime, but as a result of Kefauver hearings, J. Edgar Hoover had to admit, yes, there was no organized crime. It was terribly embarrassing to these mafiosos who treasured their privacy, tried to never appear in public. They didn't want their pictures taken. Here they are being pulled in front of the whole wide world, testifying on television about all their activities, trying to explain where all their money's coming from, and they're making up stuff. It was just one of these, the 50s, the Kefauver hearings first, and then you get the McClellan hearings later. It's a terribly embarrassing time for organized crime because, they operated in the shadows and they liked to keep a low profile and keep out of the front pages of the newspaper. Well, these hearings did just accomplish just the opposite of that. And so you're going to see a response by organized crime to try to counteract what government seems to be doing, which is this witch hunt to expose all the organized crime figures in America and put an end to it. This is why 1960, the presidential election, is going to be so, they're going to be so interested in who the winner is. They're going to be so interested in which candidate they can control, because if they can get their guy in 1960 as president, he can shut down all this effort by the Congress to go to war with organized crime. But this is the early part of the decade, and it's just kind of starting. And Lansky offers to put Holt in, this is how Holt described it, at the International Rescue Committee as controller, which is another form of an auditor or an accountant working from inside the organization. Holt thought that the International Rescue Committee was, you know, sort of a charity organization. And they purported themselves to be just that. But once he got inside, he learned that the IRC was just basically a front for the CIA. It was a proprietary interest of the CIA, meaning he is now employed by the mob and the CIA. He's still working for Licavoli. He's still working for Lansky. In fact, Lansky's the one to put him in this job, which tells you about the relationship between the mob and the CIA, which predates 1953. This is when Chauncey Holt gets put in at the IRC, but the fact that Lansky can go to the CIA and say, hey, I want my guy in as controller at the IRC, tells me that the mob and the CIA already had a relationship. You know, sometimes we think, oh, it just started when Fidel Castro came into power in 59. No, this predates that. In fact, I tell the story of how the mob worked on behalf of the United States government in another video about how the mob and the U.S. government partnered during World War II, the invasion of Sicily and Italy. So this goes back to the 40s. So he now finds himself working for the mob and the CIA. These are two heads of the same coin. Again, I cannot stress this enough. People sometimes mistakenly differentiate the mob, the CIA, and the Cubans. Now, the Cubans haven't really entered into the equation yet, and that won't happen to the late 50s, when Fidel Castro and the revolution of Cuba and all that. But already you're saying the mob and the CIA are working together. So anytime you see in the 50s something that the mob was involved in, some deep, secretive kind of thing that the mob was involved in, you bet your bottom dollar that the CIA was involved in it as well, and vice versa, because they were working together on all these things. So this was the beginning of his use of aliases. Chauncey tells the story how in his capacity as controller of the IRC and then later doing covert work for the CIA, he had aliases Jack R. Moon, Kearney Sigler, Dean Rutz, and there were others, but those are the three he used most often. Jack Moon was the one that he used the most. And this was so that he could hide his true identity. This became necessary when a lot of these guys were floating back and forth, because if you have the same name and you're working for the mob, and then on Monday and then on Tuesday you're working for the CIA, same guy, it's pretty clear to show the connections there and how the mob and the CIA are using the same people. But if you change names and you have aliases when you're working for one, and then your real name when you're working for the other, at least the people aren't paying close attention. It looks like two separate people. So you see an effort there by the CIA to hide the fact that some of the people that they're involved in are mafia people, organized crime figures. His first big shot with the CIA was his involvement with in 53 and 54 with the overthrow of the government of Guatemala. And he was sent to a secret CIA base in Arizona to train for this mission. And his alias for this particular mission was Robert Ralston. And he was sent down to Guatemala by the CIA as a 5-man assassination team that went down first to recruit a CIA-approved candidate to oppose Arbenz in the election. And I won't get into all the whys and wherefores, but this is a documented operation. It's called Operation PB Success. In the 70s, when church hearings came out, we got the family jewels and we got all the documents about how the CIA overthrew the government in Guatemala and Iran, began trying to do the same thing in Cuba. So this is widely known. But anyway, he was sent down as a five-man assassination team to recruit a CIA guy, somebody, a puppet, to oppose Arbenz in the upcoming election. And they recruited a guy named Carlos Castillo Armas. He had been put in a Guatemala prison, but he was American educated. And the reason he was put in a prison, because obviously Arbenz knew he was there to stir up trouble. He had been arrested during an earlier coup attempt, and he was actually slated to be executed. So this team of five guys, including Chauncey Holt, went down there, paid off the right people, and walked Armas right out of prison. According to Chauncey, they just, right in the middle of the day, they just went in, paid the right people, and they walked out with him. And so now the CIA has a guy who's American educated, who was their puppet. The guy they originally sent in to lead a coup got arrested. Now they freed him from prison, and they back him with a 300-man army paid for by the CIA, and they invaded Guatemala from neighboring Nicaragua. During that invasion, Chauncey flew a C-47. Remember, he's a trained pilot, and his job was to, quote, push ordnance out the door, which means drop bombs, or drop leaflets on the people. And this was a favorite tactic of the CIA, to try to propagandize the people with these leaflets written in the native language, to try to get them to join in with the invasion. Did the same thing in the prior to the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban people, right? This is why the CIA always, in this particular instance, they tell Eisenhower, well, what's going to happen is this 300 is going to grow to a lot more, because all these people that we've propagandized are going to join the 300. It's going to be this overwhelming force, and it's going to appear to be organic. It's all these Guatemalan people overthrowing their own government. It won't look like we're doing it. And they told the same thing to Kennedy prior to the Bay of Pigs. Of course, it didn't happen. Didn't happen here either. It's one of the reasons why the CIA got reliant on backup from the U.S. military, because all their predictions, none of them ever came true. So they always had to go to the president. And during the 50s, that was Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon. They'd go to him and say, hey, we need backup. They'd authorize it. Otherwise, the operation would fail. Americans would have egg all over their face. And so in Bay of Pigs, when it started to fail, they went to Kennedy expecting the same thing. Only this time, Kennedy said no. Anyway, Arbenz ends up fleeing the country, and Eisenhower gives a speech and claims credit and says Guatemala is now back in the hands of the people, which of course it's not. It's now in the hands of a CIA puppet who has been put in power. And of course, Chauncey was there to see it happen. He was part of the whole operation. All during this time, and this is important to again, I'm stressing this. All during this time, he's working for the CIA at the IRC, and now he's been trained in Arizona. He went down to Guatemala. He's a fully fledged CIA asset now. He's still maintaining his mob connections, providing services to these two organized crime figures, Peter Licavoli at the top, Meyer Lansky at the bottom, whenever they're needed. So he is essentially floating back and forth between two worlds, as I mentioned earlier. All right, so Guatemala has succeeded. And he was, obviously one of the major players there. And we get to the late 50s, early 60s, and we have a similar situation in Cuba where a revolution has taken place, and the American puppet, Batista, has been overthrown by someone who is hostile, or at least perceived as hostile, to America's interests. He's kicked out all the mafiosos. He's nationalized all the big industry, sugar, mining, et cetera, et cetera. And so now there is going to be an effort to take out Fidel Castro. But before we get to Castro in Cuba, we got to talk about the Dominican Republic, because the CIA went through several dispensations of their efforts to get rid of Castro. Their first effort was to enlist the help of Rafael Trujillo, which is their guy in the Dominican Republic. And basically they say, all right, your assignment is to assassinate Castro. And when Trujillo either failed or didn't come through, the State Department, it's kind of interesting. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. The CIA was working with Trujillo to assassinate Castro. Meanwhile, the State Department had decided that Trujillo was a bad guy, and they wanted to assassinate Trujillo. So you had the CIA working with Trujillo to assassinate Castro, you had the State Department working against Trujillo to assassinate Trujillo. March 17th, 1961, CIA found out during that period of time what the State Department was up to, and so they decided to go along with what the State Department wanted in this case. So they sent a letter to a CIA team, including Chauncey Holt. Remember, he'd been part of a 5-man assassination team that went to Guatemala. And in this message, they said, quote, "In case you plan to hunt this territory, recommend high-powered foreign-made rifle with telescopic scope and silencer. Have already obtained necessary licenses and paid the fees." And so that meant that now Chauncey and his assassination team have the go-ahead to assassinate Trujillo. And sure enough, Trujillo was murdered 2 weeks later. So we've got all these interesting little dynamics within our own government where the State Department and CIA sort of are coming at things from two different angles. And the big enemy is going to be Castro, but they're going to have to forced to deal with Trujillo first. CIA thinks Trujillo can be worked with to assassinate Castro. The State Department disagrees. CIA eventually capitulates, and Chauncey Holt is part of the assassination team that gets the blessing of the CIA to assassinate him. 2 weeks later, they do. All right. Well, that takes care of the Dominican problems, at least as far as the State Department CIA is concerned. Trujillo is now out of the way. So if you're counting, Chauncey Holt has now been part of 2 coup or overthrows, 1 assassination. One is the overthrow of the Guatemalan leader, Arbenz, and now he's been a part of the assassination of Trujillo in Dominican Republic. And so now he's on to target number 3, which is Castro. Lansky had a $1 million contract out to kill Castro. There's rumors that Lansky personally lost $1 million when he was kicked out of and to flee Cuba quickly overnight, and he lost $1 million in that hasty escape, and so now he's offered a $1 million contract to kill Castro. Again, we have infighting between the State Department and the CIA. Chauncey maintains, I heard him in a video talking about this, that Lansky's plan, they had it all set up, and he already had a guy on the inside and to assassinate Castro, but the State Department called it off, and there was this infighting going on between the State Department and the CIA, and the CIA and Lansky were working together. So when the CIA decided to go along with the State Department again, like they did with Trujillo, they told Lansky, you got to call off this hit. But that's not the end of it, obviously. We know there's going to be hundreds of attempts on Castro's life. The CIA didn't give up. They turned to Lansky to help insert agents and arms and ammunition. And we all know what that was. It was Operation 40. The effort sort of morphed early on from trying to assassinate Castro to trying to overthrow his government and to sabotage all things Castro government related. and maybe his people would overthrow him. We'll burn their crops. We'll blow up their bridges and their roads and all kinds of things that the Cuban people will blame on Castro, and eventually they'll want to overthrow him themselves. That was the Operation 40, which later morphs into Operation Mongoose, during which we have the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which again was sort of like a do-over of what happened in Guatemala. We'll send a small force, we'll propagandize the people, we'll sabotage and sabotage and sabotage, and by the time the invasion force lands, the Cuban people will be primed and ready to join in the invasion, and together we'll all overthrow Castro and live happily ever after and be like what Eisenhower said, return Cuba to the Cuban people. Right? Well, of course, it didn't work out that way because the Bay of Pigs failed spectacularly. By the way, just so you understand why it failed, I'm sort of pulling from other history here. We found out later that Santos Trafficante, the mafia don down in Florida, from whom the CIA was recruiting all these Cubans, these exiles, to train and land on the beaches at Bay of Pigs. Turns out Santos was a double agent. He was working partly for the CIA, providing all this manpower to launch the invasion, but he was also working for Castro, providing intelligence about what the CIA was up to. So Castro always knew when the CIA was trying something. All right, so I mentioned Operation Mongoose. Operation 40 was what it was originally called after the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy, who becomes the new president in 61, promises Khrushchev, we won't mess around, we won't meddle in Cuba's affairs anymore. And as evidence of that, I'm going to cancel Operation 40. He didn't, he lied. All I did was change the name, turn it into Operation Mongoose. This was just a continuation of Operation 40, a continuation of what's been going on between Lansky and Santos Trafficante and the CIA, an effort, a joint operation between the CIA and organized crime to overthrow Castro's government and kill him. In December 14th, 1961, so Kennedy's been president about a year at this point, top echelon members of organized crime and the CIA met to plan Operation Mongoose. Okay, so Operation 40 went up to April 17th of 1961, which is the day Bay of Pigs happened. I remember that always because that's my birthday. And then, of course, he made that promise to Khrushchev. And by the time we get to December, they're down there meeting about changing the operation code name from 40 to Mongoose, and they're meeting. It's the same people. It's these organized crime people and these CIA people. And they're meeting at a place called Bermuda Dunes, which is in California. It's an airport. And Chauncey was there. Peter Licavoli came with Chauncey. The two of them came from Arizona. Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana came from Chicago. These are all mafia people. And of course, Chauncey is also CIA. William King Harvey, who is the assassination guru of the CIA, has come from Langley, Washington, D.C., CIA headquarters. And he is the organizer of this Operation Mongoose. He ran the meeting, according to Chauncey, and he was at that time head of Task Force W. Task Force W was all the assassination operations the CIA had running at that time. One was, and of course, we didn't know about this. Nobody knew what Task Force W was. Chauncey did, but the American people didn't until the 70s during the church hearings. We found out executive action was the CIA's assassination program to take out foreign heads of state using foreign mercenaries. And ZR Rifle, which was run concurrently with executive action, was the assassination program here domestically to take out a domestic target, which, of course, we learned was JFK. ZR Rifle was literally started 5 months after Bay of Pigs, and it was shut down 5 months after JFK was assassinated. It only had one target. And William Harvey was in charge of both of these. And so here he is. There's a picture of him out at Bermuda Dunes. And according to the memos that Chauncey Holt saved from this meeting, Operation Mongoose would involve a quote, an executive action component, which means it's it's partly to overthrow the government, cause all kinds of problems for Castro's government. It's also to assassinate him, Che Guevara, uh, his brother. Uh, I'm forgetting his brother's name. Uh, my goodness, I can't believe it. Castro had a brother. Uh, oh, can't believe I can't remember his name. Anyway, it was to assassinate the top three and also five other commandos that had been with them in the revolution. And figure if they lop off the top of the government would fall. And the target was, and they never referred to him by name. He was always called the Beard, which according to Chauncey meant Castro. And the ground rules established by William Harvey in this meeting at Bermuda Dunes and corroborated by the memos was that this is a CIA only operation, which, according to Chauncey, meant, of course, the CIA hired and employed all these mafia individuals. So basically, what the CIA is saying is, we're not involved in the State Department anymore. No other area of government needs to know about this. This is CIA only, which means mafia and CIA, which of course would then include the Cubans, because the Cubans were the mafia figures in Florida that were in Santos Traficante's family, and they were the ones that are going to be used to blend into the Cuban population, infiltrate it, sabotage it, and try to assassinate Castro. So here's where you get your nexus of all these three groups. You got the CIA, the mafia, and the Cubans. And of course, the CIA's in charge, but they're using the mafia and the Cubans to accomplish and do all their dirty work. Ground rules included maximum security of all information, meaning it was key that nobody ever be non-attribution. One of the elements that Harvey said was important was non-attributability. Means we're going to use code names, we're going to use aliases, so none of this comes back to us. And we all have plausible deniability. Of course, the CIA's plausible deniability will always be the same. They did it, and they'll point their finger at the mafia, or they did it, and they'll point their finger at the Cubans. And after that happens a few times, Santos Traficante himself, personally, especially figures out, okay, I'm not going to be the dunce. They're always, I think what they're setting us up to be is that if anybody ever finds out about this, they're going to blame us. They're going to blame the mob. They're going to blame the Cubans. And that means me. And so what Santos is really smart at when we get around to creating the S Force is he uses and recruits people onto this assassination team that have been paid assets of the CIA in this Operation Mongoose for the last 2 years, so that if they ever get discovered, the CIA will move heaven and earth to hide their backgrounds, because if you trace it back far enough, you're going to find out that these are CIA assets, and it'll be harder for them to plausibly deny that they were involved and point the finger exclusively at the mob and the Cubans. So that was why Santos Traficante, when we get to 60, the year 1960, and Nixon comes and says, I want to create this assassination team. Santos is wise because he's seen what's been going on. They're setting it up. They always set it up so that they come out of this smelling like a rose, but the rest of us look like a bunch of rubes. We look like the bad guys. Only information would be shared on a need-to-know basis, and nothing would be in writing. It would always be, all the communication would be face-to-face. I always get a kick out of these people who said, well, if you don't show me a document, I don't believe it happened. Well, these CIA guys, these spooks like William Harvey, they're not stupid. And they've been doing this for a living. And they're smart enough not to put things on documents and to only communicate face-to-face and to only communicate what you need to know, not anything more, and to use aliases, not use their real names, and to create these sort of these frameworks where they have plausible deniability, and all the blame can be shifted over to these patsies. It's what the CIA does. They always have a patsy. Yeah, that's what plausible deniability is. Don't look at me, look at him. And So I think when you use that as a criteria, and of course, you don't want to just make up stuff, but at the same time, just because there's not a document that points the finger back, a lot of these documents that we do get are redacted to the point where you can't make out anything anyway. And so just because there's not a document trail uh, doesn't always mean that the CIA wasn't involved. That, a lot of times to me, is evidence that the CIA is involved because they intentionally don't create document trails. And when there is a document trail, they make sure and classify everything or redact everything and pressure presidents not to release them so as to hide their involvement. It's always about hiding their involvement. This is a picture of Richard Helms in an inter-office CIA memo on August 14th, 1962, from William Harvey, who's running all this. He's running Task Force W, which means Executive Action ZR Rifle. He's running Operation Mongoose, right? And so you cannot study the JFK assassination without looking at William Harvey. That's a key guy here. Anyway, Harvey writes a memo to Richard Helms, who at that time was director of clandestine operations, all the covert stuff. He later becomes the head of the CIA. And the memo read, quote, "Our contract agents in Miami and LA," Miami were the Meyer Lansky, Santos Traficante people. LA was Chauncey Holt. That's where he lived and all his people. "Have been assured by me that no reference to this operation ever appears in our central files." So this sort of buttresses my point I made earlier. Don't go looking in Langley for all the documents that are going to point the finger at the CIA. You're going to find documents that point the finger otherwise, if you find any documents at all, and if you find any documents that aren't heavily redacted or haven't been destroyed. They're masters at this. All right, so what was Chauncey's role in this? Now, please understand what I'm doing. You're probably wondering, what's this got to do with the three tramps? We'll get to that. But I'm building a case for Chauncey's extensive involvement over the years in the CIA activities and mafia activities, so that you see when we get to Dallas why he's there. It makes sense why he's there. His order of business, his job was to set up a place to forge documents. Remember, he's got this painting background. He's been doing this for Peter Licavoli for years. By the time we get to 1960, 61. And so they buy this building. It's still there. This is the Los Angeles Stamp and Stationery Company. And it's a very old firm that was financially almost bankrupt, was almost insolvent, was having problems. But they owned a very valuable building in downtown LA. And as I said, the company was in financial problems. And it was ideally set up because you could use the first three floors to run your legitimate business. What did this company do? They produced banners, posters, stock certificates, bonds, etc. Some of this was pretty intricate stuff. When you get to stock certificates and bonds, that's a lot more, detailed than banners and posters. But so they have a wide range of printing and stationery and stamping, all that kind of stuff. But most importantly, and the reason they bought this company was that this firm made police badges for almost every police department in the country. So, and I show a picture here that not just the ID badges or the ID that you would carry around your wallet, but also the badges, which is where the stamping comes in. And so what Chauncey and his folks did is they reserved the top floor. As you can see at the bottom three floors, and then he reserved the top floor for all their clandestine disinformation operations. In other words, the employees, they just basically just changed they didn't even change the name on the outside on the sign. They just changed ownership. And they kept all the same employees and they did all the same contracts they've been doing for years on the first three floors. But now they have a fourth floor where they can manufacture. It was basically a documentation mill where anytime the CIA needs false badges or false IDs or whatever, this is where they get it. It's literally a mill. in all of their operations going on, which wherever they might be going on where they need false IDs or false badges, this is where it came from. And Chauncey was involved in it. Okay, so now he's putting to work for the CIA what he's been doing for Peter Licavoli in Detroit. The second thing that they needed was to set up a machine shop to modify weapons. So they went and they bought this machine shop. It's called the Goleta Machine Shop. It's located at the Santa Barbara Airport. And they look like old abandoned hangars. But this is Goleta, and the building included a hangar. So shipments coming and going could just taxi directly into the hangar, and then they close the door behind them, and no one from the outside would ever know what they're unloading or loading. And so they now have an operating machine shop, continued its own work, just like the documentation mill, but they now had two new clients, the CIA and the mob. And so by 1962, and this was all under the umbrella of Operation Mongoose and under the directions or instructions of William Harvey. So by 1962, they've got, and Chauncey's involved with both, the document mill and the machine shop are up and running, and they're being used by both the CIA and the mob for purposes related to Operation Mongoose. All right, so that is episode 1. And as you can see, all I've done is begin to lay the groundwork for Chauncey. We started with his background growing up in Kentucky and how he's a bootlegger, and he got in all kinds of trouble as a kid, and he'd been put in prison a couple times. And that second time in prison, put him in a relationship with the Bloom brothers, which put him in a relationship with Meyer Lansky, who valued his math expertise, which also put him in contact with Peter Licavoli, who valued his painting expertise. And then these organized crime figures saw he was also a pilot, and he was trained in all these weapons. And this leads to these long relationships, 50 years with Licavoli, 30 years with Meyer Lansky. And of course, through Meyer Lansky, he gets affiliated with the CIA in the 50s. He gets hired in at the IRC. Next thing you know, he's in Guatemala as part of a 5-man assassination team. Next thing you know, he's assassinating Rafael Trujillo in Dominican Republic. Next thing you know, he's neck deep in Operation Mongoose to take out Castro and Castro's government. And he's now got two bosses. He's got the CIA on one hand, he's got the organized crime on the other. And you can see he's sort of transitioning to more an employee of the CIA now than he is organized crime, because now he's part of this documentation mill and this machine shop, doing all this false badges and false IDs, etc., for the CIA. Of course, the mob's going to be using them because they're working together. They're partners in this whole thing. But who's calling the shots is the CIA. And so that's episode 1. And when we get to episode 2, we'll get into his, we've covered his first big shot today and his second big shot. And we'll start with his third big opportunity with the CIA in our next episode, which will be episode 2. Hope you enjoyed that. Feel free to check out my website, sphistory.com. If you know anybody who's homeschooled, needs a teacher or needs a curriculum, that website will explain all the details are there on that website. Feel free to check out my YouTube channel. Also, my Patreon channel, where you can get access to all the videos and all the topics that I cover. The YouTube has a select few, as does Spotify, as does Rumble, but all of them are on Patreon for a nominal subscription fee. Thank you. I hope you all have a great day. Merry Christmas. God bless.